All right, Pierre. Thanks for doing this on short notice.
Of course. Always happy to come chat.
Feel like, as I was telling you before, that feels like a hold my beer type episode, but I'm also really excited for it. We're going to talk about the difficulty target and the difficulty adjustment, what it is, its significance to the network, and how it works. And we're going to describe it like we're five so that everybody can understand. Before we get into that, though, if you could share in your words how you think about the function of mining and the mining function relative to other network nodes that are non-mining.
Yeah, great question. So I think that the mining function is really dual purpose. So there's two functions to it. And I think that sometimes they get conflated a little bit. So first of all, the biggest from an economic perspective is about issuing new Bitcoin onto the ledger. So there's this issuance schedule with the halvings that looks at what block height are we at, and so how much new Bitcoin are we creating every 10 minutes. Now, I use these words loosely. I know that our friend Phil would say that they're incorrect words because the issuance schedule was set on day zero back at end of 2008, beginning of 2009, whenever Satoshi coded it. He released it in January 2009. The issuance schedule hasn't changed since then. And so really from an accounting perspective, you could think of it as a transfer from this retaining pond, this set of 21 million Bitcoin onto spendable UTXOs.
Yeah, so like Phil has this idea that, and we recorded with Phil 2 episodes ago. Okay. So this is episode 6. He recorded episode 4. That all 21 million Bitcoin already exists. I personally, it's like, I agree with that, but I also think it's easier to conceptualize that the Bitcoin are being issued like the term that you used, or that they're entering circulation, however you want to describe it.
I think entering circulation it should be compatible with Phil's view.
Yeah.
Because so now the other part of it too is that if we I think it is, he's making a very important point, because when you hold one Bitcoin, you hold a maximum of 1 out of 21 million. So you own a fixed percentage of the supply and can't get diluted out of that. And so when people say they talk about like Bitcoin inflation, like I don't think that's the correct term to use. In fact, I would argue Bitcoin is neither inflationary nor deflationary. It just has a fixed supply of 21 million. And so then, if we think about deflation more loosely of, okay, putting aside the monetary policy, what happens in practice? Yeah, some people lose Bitcoin. And so there's, deflation in that sense, but that's unverifiable. We don't know how much Bitcoin has been lost exactly. There's heuristics of estimating that. But in any case, that's the first function of Bitcoin mining, and doing it in a way that is competitive. Because if we look at the history of monetary economics, even if we look at gold, the way gold enters into circulation historically has generally been through a minting process. And so you take raw metal and you put it through this minting function, and then it comes out as spendable coins. And that historically, what rulers do, what states and sovereigns do, is they want to monopolize that, and so they take over the mints.
And they decide when to mint, and how much to mint,
and whose face to put on it.
Yeah,
and how much, and what the percentages should be of the coinage, and that's where we get into currency debasement. So, it's really important to have, if we're going to have a decentralized system, for the issuance of the asset to also be decentralized. And the only way to have that in practice would be to have it be competitive. You could also look at more modern alternatives, like, for example, what Ethereum did with their presale. But,
competitive in the sense that anybody can participate.
Correct. Yeah. Permissionless.
Yeah.
Not that everybody is participating, which would be more of an egalitarian spin on it, but really it's about equality of opportunity that, from day zero, all the Bitcoin that have entered into the UTXO set have done it through a process that anyone could have participated in.
And entering into the UTXO set, also for more common parlance, entering into the circulating supply.
Yeah.
And then beyond the issuance, what go forward, say like when all 21 million Bitcoin are in circulation, what function are miners providing in that world? They're doing it today as well, but then how does that also distinguish, say, from how a non-mining node helps secure the network?
So, to your point, we don't really have to go, I don't think that we have to go far in the future to see this function, because this has also been around since day zero, which is about essentially providing a sequence function for transactions, meaning that how do we figure out if somebody tries to spend the same Bitcoin twice, which one is valid and which one is invalid? And so if you look at today's banking system and you go and try to spend the same dollars twice, they will decline the second charge based on a clock that they have in their system. And so the bank is the one that's ordering the transactions to figure out, okay, which one are we going to decline and void? So obviously we can't do that in a decentralized system. So what the mining function is akin to a decentralized clock that is ticking every 10 minutes and creating batches of transactions such that if a transaction already spent an output in the past, going forward, if somebody tries to spend that same output, it would be marked as invalid, and that transaction would fail to be included in a block and fail to be broadcast out to the network.
Functionally, how do we coordinate all of the activity that might be happening in the network at any point in time when people don't know each other, and they're in different corners of the world, but need to know which transactions happen first?
Exactly right.
And then within there, how do you think about the mining function specifically to final settlement? Because I think that they're related.
Yeah, they are. So the way that miners get paid for including a transaction is through the transaction fee. So if you're sending Bitcoin, you have to send a little bit less than you are unlocking. And that little residual difference goes to whichever miner includes it in a block. And so the transaction fees are really the sum of all of the transactions included in a block get added to that new issuance, which if you go into the source code, it's called the subsidy. I don't like that terminology. I think that's one of the worst words Satoshi picked up, but because that has all sorts of connotations in economics.
What would have been a better word?
I would have put new issuance or then we could get into maybe Phil would have better terminology for
not significant to this conversation, but I was just curious.
Yeah. Because subsidy implies like the government like subsidizing something.
Agree.
But I do think that if you look at the white paper, the reason why Satoshi used that word subsidy is because in his mind, it was subsidizing people running Bitcoin nodes, because at the time, those two functionalities of mining and operating a node were so intertwined that they're essentially a bundle in Satoshi's mind. And when you read the white paper, it seems like, he is bundling those two functions together. Not completely though, because he does in the white paper talk about network nodes that are distinct from mining nodes. So already he was starting to draw a distinction between those two functionalities. But if we think about today, how is the software architected? You've got people will talk about a Bitcoin mining company, all right, that has lots of mining rigs. And is that a miner? Well, in the parlance of Satoshi, it's interesting because for the most part, they don't even need to operate a Bitcoin node. Why? Because that mining rig is connecting to a third-party mining pool, and that mining pool can be operating a Bitcoin node. And that mining pool actually is under no obligation from a technical perspective to be operating a mining node. In fact, if we go look at the history of Bitcoin, there was this thought of what was called SPV mining, where you're not running a full node, and it was like headers first SPV mining. And the idea was to make it so that you could be as efficient as possible in constructing your block template so that you're not having to have the full verification. And then that got exploited. And so
how was it exploited?
Yeah,
this is something I don't remember this, or maybe it predated my time.
Yeah, I'd have to refer back to a Greg Maxwell post on this because he's obviously OG legend in Bitcoin history, but to get into specifically how it was exploited. But he was pointing out that like here's why you shouldn't do this is because of this happened in the past. But I think it proves an important point, which is that Bitcoin mining pools operate a Bitcoin node for the same practical reasons as anybody else, which is to verify that the history of the chain is valid and that they have valid transactions and that their reward is valid. And so, every Bitcoin block has a transaction that is very special. It's called the Coinbase transaction. Brian Armstrong stole that name to, benefit his company, but
it actually confuses a lot of people.
Yeah.
When you're explaining technically how Bitcoin works and you talk about the Coinbase transaction, they think that it's a transaction from Coinbase. Good name for a company, but
Yeah, I still think it shows a lack of ethics on his part. Just clobbering the namespace. And that transaction's special because it doesn't have any inputs, so it's not unlocking any existing outputs, but it does have outputs. And so those outputs are, if you sum up the quantity of Bitcoin being locked up in those outputs, that's going to equal or be less than, which is interesting, to the sum of the transaction fees and the subsidy. It can actually be less than, and there's cases where miners have left Bitcoin on the table due to bugs in their software. And so that's where actually we're going to have less than 21 million Bitcoin because of that. Historically, some miners have accidentally not minted the correct amount of Bitcoin they were supposed to.
The asymptotic top was always going to be slightly less. Is that correct? And then
for a number of reasons.
And then this, what you mentioned specifically, lowers it slightly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like one of the reasons is like if you just model out the ideal issuance curve and you assume like full supply, it is not 21 million. It's like 0.9999997, right below 21 million.
Yeah. And then a lot of people, and I don't think that you agree, but I want to just ask the question. You don't think of that, what Satoshi called the subsidy, as a security budget?
So,
or do you?
Well, it depends because I've heard compelling arguments that it adds to the security budget, and I've heard compelling arguments that it subtracts from the security budget. And I fall more into the latter camp. Now, when we think about security, first of all, that terminology is so broad because there's security of private keys, which has nothing to do with transaction fees and the subsidy. Right. It has to do with, what Unchained does, what lots of, people self-custodying do and all of this. So, there's that. And then there's also the security of the network from DDoS, for example, from, malicious actors, where really the role of Bitcoin nodes is very important and the role of transaction fees and the subsidy are secondary. So really, when people talk about the security budget, what they should be talking about is transaction finality. And they just use that terminology interchangeably when really I think that then it's basically like a source of FUD because now you're playing up transaction finality to be the security of the system, kind of broadening the scope of it where I'm like, that's not really appropriate.
Right. And transaction finality is so important because in the example you were given before where it's important to know which transaction happens first. It's also important if I send you a Bitcoin and you give me your car, then I couldn't end up with my Bitcoin and your car.
Right. So like classic double spend would be that, I thought I received the Bitcoin. And let's say 3 blocks have gone by. So I got 3 confirmations. So it was included in a block 3 blocks ago. I give you the car, you drive away, you drive to your mining facility. you rewrite the ledger history to remove that transaction and ideally put in a different one that, still goes to your wallet. And then that means that when I look at my wallet, that balance is now 0. And so now you have the car and the Bitcoin. And so I think that's called a Finney attack is kind of the word for that. But so it's really important to not have that happen because then that would undermine people's ability to use this as a monetary system. So when we think about the subsidy versus transaction fees, really in the security budget, we're asking the question of how do we prevent that from happening? There's other attacks. So you could imagine there's attacks where you just mine empty blocks and you don't include any transactions. And so you're essentially preventing anybody from transacting on the network, and that maybe that would cause the price to crash or something like that. And then there's attacks where, and so that's really a denial of service type attack on transactions. There's also attacks where you're stealing revenue from other miners. And so you could have a minority of the hash rate that is selectively revealing their chain to take revenue away from miners. But all of these things, I think, are very much more theoretical than they are practical. And we can get into that. But just in terms of the security budget, the second point I want to make is that not only is the word security like overblown, the word budget is also very misunderstood because people think of, they'll post a chart of transaction fees historically, and the transaction fees are going down and the subsidy is going down in Bitcoin terms.
Yeah, in nominal terms.
And then they'll say, well, look, Bitcoin's security budget is decreasing. Well, a budget, typically when you think about budgeting, you're thinking about the future. You're not looking at the past. And so one is that if we did have a budget back then and we said, okay, the budget is 50 Bitcoin every 10 minutes, right? That's what it was in 2009. And so now with the first halving in 2012, now we need 25 Bitcoin of subsidy and 25 Bitcoin transaction fees. We didn't get that, right? So even back first halving, like there was no way the transaction fees were making up for the decrease in the subsidy. And so somebody could say, oh, well, Bitcoin is less secure at that point. I would say, if you come under budget, that's probably a good thing because that means that the transactors got what they needed, transaction finality, at a lower cost than they expected, whether it's in the form of dilution of issuance or in the form of transaction fees. And so I really see like mining from a Bitcoin user perspective is a cost center, right? Like we have to put up with the fact that we have to give miners money. It's not like
to get transaction finality.
Yeah. It's not something to be celebrated of, oh, we wasted a ton of money on mining to get the same amount of finality.
Yeah, I look at it as like an efficient network should be able to do the same function for less and less of the overall output over time. And I'm curious here is that what it like, because I personally think the idea of security budget is like in a nominal term or an absolute term is a misnomer because it's like, well, what ensures transaction finality? It's just a nominal amount of currency. The value of that is dependent on how much people value it. So it ultimately becomes how much and how many people value Bitcoin that determines the value of what miners are being paid at any time, as well as the amount of transaction activity. But then it's what ensures transaction finality. And that, to me, it seems like that is a function of decentralization.
I view it this way, is that the true security budget is how much would people be willing to pay to get into the next block? And so it really is about contention at the tip, and it's about potential fees. And you can't see that, right? So you can't see that unless you were to say, all right, I'm going to start mining empty blocks and I'm going to see what happens, because the way transaction fees get set is in the mempools. So each Bitcoin node, or you can actually run a Bitcoin node without a mempool. So, but if you're running a mining pool, you're going to want to know what are the transactions competing to get into the next block in order to make your block template. And you're going to rank order them by what is their fee rate. And so if there's a lot of demand for block space, there's a lot of transactions, and the network is getting, quote unquote, congested, fee rates go up. And historically, during times where, for example, at end of 2017, during that bull market, up to $20,000, that was the top. We thought we were euphoric at the time. Today we'd be depressed at 20K.
We're depressed at 108,000. So we'd be depressed at 20,000 for sure.
Yeah. So at the time, transaction fee rates went sky high. And so it was just because of how much demand there was for block space. And that is kind of the revealed preference, but that preference is hidden in times where you don't have a lot of demand to get into the next block. And so the real security budget is actually unknown, because it's really about what are people's subjective preferences about transaction finality in the extreme scenario of like they're all bidding against each other.
They're all bidding against each other, and then what prevents them from essentially redoing the work?
Well, so then on the hasher side, or on the mining side, they're looking at, okay, well, what maximizes my expected value, assuming they're rational, right? And so if they're going to look at two different block templates, one has lots of transaction fees by including transactions. The other is empty because that would be censorship, right? They're trying to exclude transactions. The rational one would try to include as many transactions as possible. And so then if there is, let's say there was like 60% of the hash rate that was mining empty blocks, all of these transactions are accumulating in the mempool and causing transaction fees to increase until you have either defectors from that 60% of hash rate being like, that's a lot of money to leave on the table. Like we're going to point our hash rate to an honest node, or new hash rate comes online. And that's actually really important, that the entry into the set of hash rate is permissionless. And so even if somebody has 99% of the hash rate, they can't stop new entrants from coming in. And so that's really a huge difference with proof of stake, for example, where they actually can stop stakers, because staking itself is a transaction. Hashing is not a transaction. And so that's another like huge difference when we think about proof of stake versus proof of work. There's a huge cost attached to being an attacker, I think, is the underlying premise of proof of work. And that's really what, then if you look at it from a game theory perspective, if you as the attacker know that your attack can be undone by others, you're just not even going to bother. You're going to find other ways to attack. And there's lots of other ways to attack Bitcoin than to just do the brute force method of 51% attack that are less expensive. In fact, like people talk about, what's the cost of renting hash rate, right? Well, it would be less expensive to do like a cyber attack, or to have like insiders at pools, collude.
But even there, like what ensures that the collusion, because like that's where I get to decentralization necessarily being part of like what ensures the finality of like there might be an incentive to potentially attempt to collude, but if each individual actor represents a smaller share, their own expectation of what they could influence diminishes and diminishes. Do you think that?
So I think Bitcoin mining is always decentralized. Let's take the reductio ad absurdum of there's one dude in his parents' basement in his underwear. He's mining on his laptop. He has 100% market share because where the year is 2,200, all the subsidies gone, and transaction fees are extremely low. And so economically, the only thing that's justified is one guy mining on his laptop. And, he's clearing, the whole world's economy on his laptop or providing final settlement services for it. And then he's like, okay, well, I'm going to start censoring some transactions. And so some transactions start getting left in the mempool. And those transactors, rationally, they start bidding up their transaction fee using RBF, using child pays for parent. And so they're starting to like put chips on the table of, hey, whoever
create an incentive for somebody else to come along.
So somebody else whips out their laptop, and there's nothing that first person can do to stop the second person from coming in and taking that money and contributing hash rate. And so even though he had 100% market share, and everybody on Twitter could be saying, hey, Bitcoin mining is centralized, this is a huge problem. Well, it's not really a problem until he effectuates and abuses that power. And then it's a self-resolving problem because there's a market mechanism and the transaction fees going up that will then cause somebody to enter the set of hashers.
All right. So now that like I understand the framework that you have there. Yeah. You mentioned before, the second function being the ordering of transactions. Now I want to dive into the hold my beer discussion of trying to explain in a way that is digestible, but I do want to get into the technicals of what the difficulty target is, what the difficulty adjustment is, and how it plays into, because if we start from the idea that if I send you a Bitcoin, I send somebody else, the network needs to know which one of those happens first. And one of them needs to be processed for transaction finality or for final settlement, and another one invalidated. All, in the scenario you just described for just illustrative purposes of discussing the incentives, setting that one aside, but going to this world of there's a lot of people out there running Bitcoin mines all over the world, practically speaking, every state in the country, every country in the world, wherever there is excess power. All of these miners, and you mentioned they're all competing with each other. In your words, describe before we get into the technical of how the difficulty adjustment works and the difficulty target, what it is and its significance to the network in ordering blocks.
So it's really a way of getting first of all, on the subsidy is that you want to prevent seigniorage. And so those monopoly profits from issuing new currency, you want there to be a cost associated with that. And the only way to have that is to have competition over it. And then what form that cost takes for Bitcoin mining is essentially the consumption of energy and of semiconductors. On the transaction side, the importance there is to make sure that we don't need to have a proof of authority of some kind of centralized clock that is saying, okay, whose transactions come in first. Wells Fargo very recently, they entered into litigation over this because they were reordering people's transactions to maximize overdraft fees.
Oh, I remember this.
So whoever controls the clock actually has a lot of control over the user experience of the system, right? And that conceivably they would also be in a position to give themselves more Bitcoin. And so it's really Now, the other part that we have to keep in mind is that when they find when they mine a block, they're not imposing it on the network. They're actually proposing it to the network. And so all the Bitcoin nodes, when they receive that block, they make sure that not only is the proof of work part of it valid, which we'll get into soon, but they also make sure that all the transactions are valid and that there's a list of rules of the Bitcoin protocol that are being followed, including the new issuance, the block size limit, and that is, and this gets into kind of the area where there's a lot of debate going on right now about, is Bitcoin just a database or is it money? Well, the rules that the Bitcoin nodes are filtering with, to use a lot of term, they're really optimized to create a transactional monetary system. They're really that's what their intent is. It's not any other kind of intent. And one that also, and here's where we enter into tension, is censorship resistant. So, for example, like the block size limit, on one hand, you've got people like Roger Ver who will say, well, you're censoring transactions that could go into making that block bigger by having the block size limit. But the counter would be that the block size limit allows for one, low cost of operating a Bitcoin node, which you don't want to censor Bitcoin nodes, because if you censor Bitcoin nodes, then there's no way to verify the monetary supply. There's no way to be self-sovereign. And it also alleviates the problem of censorship of network traffic. So a smaller block can fit through the Tor network, for example, more easily than a large block. And so there's always going to be competing claims of this person's censoring me, and the retort being, no, I'm trying to make it more censorship resistant. And so, hopefully that triggers everyone. Where were we?
I feel like it should have triggered. We covered a lot of basis of like triggerable offenses.
Yeah.
So now bringing it to, and I think it was, you made an important comment about the blocks being proposed, and that the individual blocks have a number of rules that determine validity, and that they check to see, each node checks to see in a block that is proposed by a miner, are all the transactions in it valid? Is the amount of Bitcoin being issued or entering circulation, is it consistent with the fixed supply schedule of 21 million? But then there's the difficulty target. Does this block meet the difficulty target? So what is the difficulty target?
Well, sorry, I wanted to make one additional historical note on the blocks being proposed, because we actually have a case study of a block was proposed by a pool where they included the fees and the subsidy in the Coinbase, but they had a bug in their software such that they didn't include any transactions. And so for any node verifying it, it seemed like they were trying to inflate the supply of Bitcoin, because they were adding the fees without there being transactions to pay for those fees. And the Bitcoin nodes all rejected it as invalid.
Okay, I remember this block, but I did not realize that was the issue with it. So the other nodes interpret it, because the transactions weren't there, but the fees were, that all of those fees were the
subsidy, basically.
Subsidy, because they weren't actually validating the transactions. They weren't in the block.
Right. And so what it proves is that even though this block had the most work, and even though you could say, that if the miners are in charge, that block would have gotten into the blockchain. But the reality is that the miners are not in charge. So even if they've got the most hash rate, the most work, if they have an invalid block, then it got discarded, and that mining pool received zero revenue.
Right. And then and part of that, though, is that they're competing with each other, and that they don't have because they're distributed and they don't know each other, in part, they don't have an incentive to let somebody else have or get a reward that doesn't have valid work.
Right.
Or invalid work.
Well, it's a bit of a prisoner's dilemma. Like, if you don't include a transaction in your block to collect that fee, somebody else is going to. And so then you have a game theory incentive of including it in.
Right. But you made a comment that I think is getting to the heart of it, which is so it's not enough to have the most work or the longest proof of work. Everything also has to be valid.
Right.
But explain the concept of the most work.
Right. So most work, you could. So let's talk about the difficulty, because essentially when Satoshi launched Bitcoin, he was mining on his Pentium 4, and let's say the second person comes online and starts mining. So when he launched Bitcoin, let's say and the way that the nodes calibrate things, we want to block every 10 minutes. And so let's see where to start the explanation. It's kind of a chicken and egg thing. Let's start it with what is the difficulty. It's a number that you're trying to get under as the miner, because let's think about what mining is. First of all, hashing. Okay, so a hash function, you take a piece of data, you pass it through a hash function, and you essentially get a cryptographic fingerprint of that data that's specific to the data you put in. So if you put the same data in through the same hash function, you will get the same output. It's deterministic.
It could be like, for simplifying terms, so they know it's not this simple, but you put a string of information in and it outputs 9, and then you put a string of information in and it outputs 8. It could be, you put a string of numbers in, it could be 100.
Right.
And in practical reality, it's
256 zeros and ones.
Right.
Yeah. SHA-256 is the hashing function that Bitcoin mining uses.
So when you say getting under, it's that you're putting information in and continuing to try to hit a number that's below a certain number.
Threshold. Yeah. You can think of it like at a Hawaiian luau party, right? You're like trying to get under the bar, right? I forget what that was.
If it gets lower and lower, it gets harder and harder.
Yeah, exactly. The difficulty increases. And it's probabilistic. So if you think about 256 zeros and ones, so a hash function is random. So if you put in different data, even if it's different by a tiny bit, then the output is completely randomly different. And so when we're doing this with Bitcoin mining, the input data is what's called the block header. So the block header is information about that block, metadata, that includes what's called the Merkle root, which is the sum of all of the transaction hashes. So
and describe that in a way that somebody could interpret. Basically, an easy way to summarize all the transactions in the block.
That's right. And a way that if you change one of the underlying transactions, well, now that hash is going to be completely different. And so this is when people talk about Bitcoin being immutable, the immutable nature of Bitcoin's blockchain is really enforced by the cryptography of the hash functions. When your wallet creates a Bitcoin transaction and broadcasts it out to the network, it'll give you a transaction ID. That transaction ID is a hash of the data in that transaction, which includes the inputs that are unlocking the Bitcoin that have your digital signature that you signed with your private key. And it has the outputs of where those Bitcoin are going. And the addresses that those Bitcoin are going to. So we can start with you take that transaction ID, and then when the mining pool is choosing all of the highest fee paying transactions, it combines all the transaction IDs into one hash, which is and it does this through a cryptographic process called a Merkle tree. And so that's why the terminology is the root, is because you're summarizing all of the transactions and you're fingerprinting all of them into a very compact format. That way, the block header is very small relative to the whole block. So a whole block could be as big as 4 megabytes. The block header is a tiny fraction of that, because the Merkle root is summarizing all the transactions. In that block header, you also have the previous block header. So that is where we get into the blockchain, because that's how you chain the blocks together, is by embedding the previous block header into the next block header. And so that way, everything is interrelated, and you can't go back and change Bitcoin's past without also changing everything that follows it.
And the significance of that is knowing the state of ownership at any point in time and how it changes.
Yes. So now you know what are we building on top of with this block. We're not building on top of any other block header. We're building on top of a specific one. which actually is an interesting contrast with proof of stake, where you can actually build on top of an infinite number of previous blocks, if you want to call them. Anyway, this is going to turn into like a trashing proof of stake episode. But so so if we go back to day zero, Satoshi created the Genesis block. That's actually the only block that was not mined. But I want to reassure our listeners, the 50 Bitcoin in the Genesis block are unspendable.
Right.
Okay, so let's not get into a pre-mine conversation.
19.9 some odd million, 50.
Yeah.
First block, not mined, but can't be spent.
Can't be spent.
Invalid.
All
right, now, but coming back to so you got each block having a block header that points to the previous block header. Summarizes all the transactions basically, and what the version of the longest, kind of proof of work up at that point in time. But then coming back to, okay, we've got this difficulty target. What role does it play in basically coordinating the network function?
So the block header has the difficulty target in it as well. It's called nBits. And this represents, and so this can be calculated by any node. You don't have to be a miner to calculate what the difficulty should be. What you do is you look at the past 2016 blocks. And so, okay, if we say there's a block every 10 minutes, that means there's 144 blocks per day, and multiply 144 by 14 days, then you get to that 2016 blocks.
Okay, so that's something really important.
Yeah.
Because this would, and we're actually jumping ahead a little bit, but I think there's no way to have a linear discussion about this, which is that this was the part in Mastering Bitcoin by Antonopoulos where, because I had this question of like, okay, well, without relying on a single source of truth or an oracle to tell you what happens first, how does each miner arrive at what the difficulty target was? So you had mentioned difficulty target being, a number, and when you put in a certain amount of data into this hash function, inputting that data set, and it generates a random output, and then you check to see if it's below, and if it's not, you keep going. But then maybe like talk in a little bit more detail this idea that the miners are basically looking at all the blocks proposed, seeing the rate at which they're seeing them, and then how they actually get to the same target.
Yeah. So on day zero, Satoshi just picked an arbitrary difficulty of, well, what did he reasonably think? Maybe he probably did some testing of like, how many hashes can I generate with my Pentium 4 in 10 minutes? And then using that to calibrate the initial difficulty level. Then fast forward 2 weeks later. Now, I say 2 weeks. Let's say more hash rate came online. And so instead of 14 days, it was 12 days. Still 2016 blocks, but because basically, if we think about, okay, what's the probability of finding a number below the threshold of the target? The more attempts you have at doing that, the greater the probability that you're going to find a winning hash.
And the faster you would find it.
A good metaphor is essentially asking you to flip a coin, heads or tails, and asking you to get heads 5 times in a row. And if you don't get it 5 times in a row, then you've got to start over, right? So if you get it 2 times in a row and then you do tails, you start over. And you've got to get sequential 5 times in a row. If you're really flipping that coin very quickly, you're going to get to a result faster. If there's 2 people flipping a coin, they're going to get to one of them's going to win more quickly than if there's just one person flipping a coin, right? And then if I want to slow you guys down, I'd say, all right, get heads 6 times in a row. I've increased the difficulty. If I want to speed things up, then I'd say, all right, get it 4 times in a row. And so it really is a question of statistical probability of how quickly are you going to find that winning combination. And that's the intuition behind creating a way to calibrate that decentralized clock that is decentralized. So when the nodes look back at the past 2016 blocks, they calculate, okay, what is the time at which I saw the most recent block? And what's the time that I saw the first block in that set of 2016? And so then let's get an average of the difference between those. And that should be 10 minutes. And if it's less than 10 minutes, then I'm going to increase the difficulty such that we get back to an average of 10 minutes. And so deterministically, now, okay, so
okay, now so that's really important. But explain the significance of the 10-minute. Going back to like why
not 5 minutes? Why not 15 minutes? Or
in you could talk about it either in relation to security and orphan blocks, or just in terms of like the pulling forward of all of the issuance.
Of
Bitcoin.
Yeah. So the way that Satoshi set to issue Bitcoin, I think there's two lenses to look at it through. One is that it's arbitrary. You've just got to have some kind of schedule that gets the Bitcoin out into circulation in a way that's competitive, right? And so he could have made it so that within the first 2 weeks, all the 21 million Bitcoin got mined. For whatever reason, he wanted to spread it out over several decades. Now, half of the Bitcoin got mined, in the first 4 years. And so it definitely was front loaded in terms of the issuance. And then it tails off until the year 2140. But really, by the 2030s, 99% of the Bitcoin will be on the ledger. And so you can see that as like, okay, well, that's arbitrary. Maybe the environmentalists would say that he should have front loaded it more, because if he had done that, we would actually have less electricity consumption into Bitcoin mining today than we do have. And so like what Elizabeth Warren should be advocating for is a soft fork to remove the subsidy today. And that would actually be feasible. And I actually, technically feasible.
I don't know. Well, of course not socially feasible.
Yeah.
Changing the rules on all these guys who are running all this power to get that subsidy. But I don't know if I follow the idea that it would reduce, because it just comes back to how much people value.
No, because look, like if Bitcoin's not under attack, then transaction fees are low. And if there's no subsidy, then the top line revenue for the mining industry is low. And so it just justifies a low amount of power consumption.
Right. But then if the nominal amount declined and it was just transaction fees, but 8 billion people started valuing it, then wouldn't it?
Well, I'm just saying all else equal.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. If we had mass adoption, then I agree that the transaction fees would go up, unless, some brilliant, let's say tomorrow, some brilliant Bitcoin protocol developer comes up with some cryptographic magic that makes it so that the efficiency of using block space increases 1 millionfold. And we get 8 billion people on chain, but we only need like 400 kilobytes per block. And so transaction fees are de minimis, right? Like, and that we had no subsidy, then the power consumption of Bitcoin's proof of work would fall to almost zero. And I would argue Bitcoin is just as secure as it was today.
I'd have to think about that, because ultimately, like, again, in my framework, you have to have currency that's valuable to pay a wide number of participants, and that the more distributed and the more decentralized, the more decentralized it is. Yeah. That the more decentralized it is, the more reliable final settlement is, and the more you can pay people for power in more places, the more distributed it becomes. But setting that aside, because we don't want to give Senator Warren any ideas.
I'm happy to give her lots of ideas. I know she has very little follow through.
Yeah, honestly, it would be good for Bitcoin because it would make more people understand it. But coming back to the idea that of the target, and basically each miner, it's basically like if the blocks are being found faster, then each miner individually looks at the rate in which they saw the last 216 blocks and adjusts back to say, I saw the last 2016 in 9 minutes. I need to make it, 10 divided by 9 harder to then have the next. And the significance of that is it basically ensures that one, there's there's a period of time in which that subsidy is distributed, those decades that you mentioned.
Spread it out,
and then there also is a security component of the 10-minute, not in the sense of the security budget, but in terms of the ordering of like what's the probability that a block is found at the exact same time, probabilistically, that could create a split in the network.
So there's that, and so you want to have enough time for blocks to propagate globally, so that also, if you have lots of hash rate in North America, if you had a shorter block time, then there would be an incentive to co-locate, and hash rate would become geographically concentrated due to the block interval. But 10 minutes is long enough to get from Texas to Tokyo. In fact, obviously, if you look at the speed of fiber optics, like it gives you lots of wiggle room.
Right, but then at any interval, if it was probabilistically 10 minutes or if it was probabilistically 9 minutes or 11 minutes, there's some medium where if it's probable that it's going to take 10 minutes, that it's also possible that two miners find it in a very short period of time simultaneously.
But that happens, right?
It does. Yeah. But am I wrong in thinking that, or at least this has been my understanding, that the difficulty in it being set at that, it's not that it doesn't happen, it's going to happen, but with a certain frequency. And if it was every, say, 2 minutes, it might happen in greater frequency than if it was every 10 minutes, just probabilistically.
Yeah. That's right. In my mind, it really is about leveling the playing field from a global block propagation perspective. The other part of it too is on a practical level, like we're already, we've got hundreds of thousands of blocks. Like from a software perspective, if you had like every 1 minute, you'd have 10 times more blocks. And it just adds to the overhead of operating a Bitcoin node. If you've got, even if they had like, if you also cut the block size limit in by 10, you're just increasing the amount of like metadata overhead that the node has to deal with. Smaller issue. But the only caveat I want to add is that in the difficulty is really being set by the Bitcoin nodes. And so when a miner proposes a block, it's going to make sure that it's going to calculate the difficulty.
So, use a little bit more specific language in it, where you say the nodes are setting it.
Well, the nodes are looking at the past 2016 blocks, every 2016 blocks, and that if a miner proposes a block that has an incorrect nBits in it, that it would get rejected as invalid.
Right. So you could be a non-mining node. You're calculating
independently
the frequency with which you saw the last 2016 blocks.
And it's actually not what you saw, because the timestamp is included in the block.
I was going to get there.
Okay,
no. Like I was going to ask the question because I remember learning this, but then the question is like technically each miner might see a block at a slightly different point in time. So describe how they're able to get to the actual right amount, because it makes a difference.
So you're let's say you're mining and you put a timestamp in your block header that's like 2 days in the future. Nodes would reject that as invalid. You have to be, but if you put it 5 minutes in the future, it's fine. There's a limit to how far into the future you can put your timestamp, and so that helps keep things honest. And then also you can't.
And so does that mean that is it 5 minutes, or is that
I don't know what the exact threshold is. Yeah.
Okay, because I was wondering if like someone's hashing, if like their template, if they haven't found a block in that interval, they just update for
they
the
have
time.
to eventually update the template.
Okay.
The other part is that you can't have it be so far in the past before the previous block. Now, my understanding is that it can be the timestamp of your block can be slightly before the timestamp of the previous block. And so you've got negative time between some blocks where, you would.
Where you still, like, my understanding of that is I timestamp something. I don't know what time it is, but I timestamping 2 o'clock. You timestamp something 2:02 because you're just estimating it needs to be in this window. You actually solve a block, propagate it, that's timestamped 2:02. I then get really lucky, solve a block, the next block within the window, and it has a timestamp of 2 o'clock. And then, like, technically my block's after yours, but your timestamp is
still valid, even though things are.
But, okay, but now get back to how, if that's the case, and the timestamps aren't precise, people are ordering 2016 blocks and looking backwards to see what was the.
Well, because there's limits on how imprecise they can be over an average of 2016 blocks, that would not have an effect.
Okay, but am I right to say that if everyone calculates their own difficulty target, do they actually get to the exactly precise same number?
I'd have to double check that.
My understanding is that they
yes.
do.
Yeah,
but I'm
yes.
now like trying to. And that was one thing that was like, mind-boggling. But because if you weren't at that exact same number, then a certain number of times somebody would think that they had a probabilistic block that met the target.
So I want to more confidently say that the nBits is global and is the same for everyone, because the timestamps, even if with the wiggle room we talked about, it's in the block header and it's hashed and it's global as well. So everybody's comparing the same timestamps.
Yeah. So maybe, and then it might be, there's a timestamp of the 2016 block and there's a timestamp of the first one, and they might use.
And then they subtract those and then they divide by 2016 and then they see how many minutes.
Yeah. Okay. So, and now I always try to make it relatable, right? Because you can like start zeroing in, but like the important thing is there's a mechanism to allow everyone within the network independently from each other to sequence blocks, but then readjust as more essentially power comes online
or less
to adjust and synchronize the network such that on average the blocks come through every 10 minutes and that it doesn't materially pull forward the issuance of the supply or materially slow.
Right.
If for a period of time hash rate comes off. Now, part of, in a practical setting, the Bitcoin hash rate has increased significantly over the past since inception.
Yeah.
And so as more work, as the difficulty target is going down, the amount of work to hit the target is going up. How do you think about contextualizing the significance of more work coming online, not translating to either, faster time or more of the currency units?
Yeah. So, because of this exponential increase in hash rate, we're living in the future. So we've got blocks arriving that if you had just done, I don't even know what the block height. Do we have a block clock in here?
We do have a block clock, but is this working?
It's not on current block height. It swaps. All right. Well, we're
I'm trying to think of what is this Moscow time right now?
Logan, what block height are we at? Okay, 912,297. So if you look at, I think it was January 2nd, 2009 was the first block. And if you multiplied 912 by 10 minutes, it's probably several years, maybe or at least months in the future. But that's why you should not rely on Bitcoin's decentralized clock to, get on time to your wedding, right? Like it's not a clock for that. It's only about making sure that we're not double spending Bitcoin. And so when we think about like proof of work, I think that a really important intuition is that the work is being done by the Bitcoin miners. And so let's say, we're at 1 zettahash per second, right? And so we're generating this astronomical amount of hashes.
Put that into context, because most people, Bitcoin miners would understand maybe what a exahash or a zettahash is. Are we at a zettahash? But anyways, that's almost counter to the point. Equate it in power. Or
okay, so we can do metric system education on this podcast, right?
Yeah.
So 1 kilo hash would be 1,000 hashes per second, right? A mega hash is 1 million. A gigahash is 1 billion. A terahash is 1 trillion. So the latest generation of miners, they might be in the ballpark of like 100 to 500 terahash per second, right, of trillions of hashes per second.
Okay. So that would be 500 trillion.
Yes.
But see, like trillions the number that people.
Yeah. Already, like we're talking about the federal budget deficit. Right?
Yeah, which no one can conceive of how large that actually is.
Yeah. It's phenomenal. Now, then if we go to 1 petahash, so multiply that by 1,000, and then.
Okay, so that's
it's quadrillion. Yeah. And then you get to exahash, that's quintillion. And then zettahash. So today we're probably at like 800 exahash.
Yeah.
Which means
higher,
that,
I think like 900.
One way to think about it is that there's millions of Bitcoin mining rigs out there that are hashing to get to that.
And each one of those is consuming or requires power to hash.
Yeah. So then if we translate it into energy talk, we're probably around 22 gigawatt hours of like over an hour, 22 gigawatts.
Right. And maybe a way to think about that is that to solve the next, assume that it was, for round numbers, let's assume it's 20 gigawatts, that it would require running, probabilistically, it would require running 20 gigawatts of power for 10 minutes to
divide it by 6. Divide the 20 by 6, and that's.
Wouldn't it?
No, you're right. You're right. For 10 minutes, it doesn't matter.
It would require 20 gigawatts to solve the next 10, and that if 10 more gigawatts of power came online for a period of time, the blocks would be found sooner. But then it would adjust to say, hey, for the next, probabilistically you need to run 30 gigawatts power to solve the next block.
Yeah.
And then part of that work, this is a hard way to ask the question, but it's like you're out there mining. You might know a friend that mines, but you don't know who's, in terms of like identity solving these blocks and in each difficulty, the next block and the next 10 minutes and the next 10 for the 2016. But you need a way to know that others are actually doing the same work that you're doing, or that they're relational to each other. That basically, if like you can't fake power, or I'm trying to find some way to explain that, where you might be slightly better, be able to produce power at a cheaper cost, or set up your mine marginally better, but we're all essentially competing against the same game that is competed on the margin, such that if you're producing work, I know that the work is comparable to the work that I'm doing. But then explain that in the concept of this coordination function of we're all doing work and we're all validating each other's work to then sequence blocks, which ultimately add up to the highest level idea that we're facilitating a currency system and needing to know who has the money at what time and that people can't spend it. But kind of like just maybe, kind of going back up a level. We've been deep down in the weeds. We've kind of figured out how with no central coordination, miners have this way to figure out how much work must be done to consider the block valid, in addition to all the transactions being valid, pointing at the right version of history. But then, like the connection between, okay, if you zoom in too close, you're like, but why are you consuming all of this power?
Yeah.
Like fit that into the functioning of the broader network.
So they're consuming all this electricity to generate all of this astronomical number of hashes, and then every 10 minutes they find one hash that actually has value, and that one hash is what we call the proof, right? So all of the work gets discarded because it's not valid hashes, but they needed it to find that one valid hash, the proof, and then when they broadcast that valid hash, all of the Bitcoin nodes can verify that hash is valid using very little electricity. So there's this huge asymmetry between you're consuming all of this electricity to propose a block, and it takes a tiny, minuscule fraction of that to verify that what you did actually is correct. And then, so that applies.
And everyone in the network can rely upon it as good.
Right. Because if you're mining, this is the real, the reason you want to run a Bitcoin node as a mining pool is that if somebody sends you a block header and a hash and you don't verify it using your own node and you start building on top of it, you could be building on sand, right? Because it could be an invalid hash, in which case, when you find your valid hash and you broadcast it out to the network, all the nodes are going to say, no, that's not valid, because everything about it is fine except for the hash that you included in your block header. Because ultimately, when
you were basically looking at the past. We're further in the future.
If you were building on an invalid block,
yes.
So there's a hole in the history that you're trying to build on.
Right.
Contrast that with XRP, where they lost the first 30,000 blocks.
That doesn't matter.
It's gone.
Do you know why? Just create more of it.
Yeah, it's fine. There's no mining going
on.
And
that comes into this idea that you can't produce Bitcoin without a massive amount of work, and that because you said it's basically like they do all this work to think about it, it's like 20 gigawatts of power running concurrently, and obviously I'm using that number to give some order of magnitude, but it's constantly changing. Power's coming offline, power is coming online, more power is coming, machines are getting more efficient, so we don't actually know how much power
But let's also contextualize 20 gigawatts. That's approximately 1/3 of Texas electricity grid.
Yeah, at its peak.
Yeah, at its peak, yeah.
Yeah.
We're pushing it, but broadly speaking, on average.
Peak in like the spring or something, you know.
So it's a lot of electricity, but at the same time, it's not like we're, using all the electricity on the planet.
No, I don't want to present that, but that it is a significant amount, and that what it does through that process is it clears all of the value, like clearing from the perspective of everyone who sent money and bid enough to be in that next block, which you communicate the significance of that bidding process. That now we're on. Now we can get on to clearing the next financial transactions.
I would argue, more importantly. So if 95% of the Bitcoin mining revenue comes from the subsidy, then what that represents is that we have destroyed the value of the subsidy by consuming it, instead of having that be a monopoly profit of seigniorage. And so, the fact that if we look at like a natural gas power plant, that essentially we've burned natural gas in order to exhaust out the new issuance and not allow any single participant to, profit off of that from a monetary system perspective, that's how we maintain the morality of the system. Because
now I'm trying to wrap my head around it. It's that effectively I'm trying to reconcile that idea. It's that you're putting some cost to it.
Yeah.
So you're saying exhausting it, but it's like it's ensuring that there's some cost to it versus there being no cost to it.
Correct.
Because there's one scenario where there's no cost to it, which is the seigniorage, the central bank, the trusted third party can just create the money.
Yeah.
And that we're maybe not destroying the value of the subsidy, we're unlocking, we're giving it to somebody, but we're ensuring that they put in work to get it.
Their profit margin is approaching zero.
But there is some profit motive to actually do the operation.
Sure, and some are going to be better than others, right? Some are going to mine at a loss, some are going to mine at a huge profit, but that on average, the average miner should be basically at break even. The median miner, or well, the marginal miner really is going to be a break even, right?
Right. And that it, in one way you could think about it as a race to the bottom. On the other side, it is as it commoditizes.
Yeah.
It should become a very stable activity that has a very slim margin, but reliable, low return. But in the greater context of how do you coordinate a monetary system that everyone can participate in permissionlessly, and you need to reconcile that what transactions happen first. Everyone has to propose that, but then everyone else has to validate it.
Yeah.
And you need a way to order, and you need a way for, imagine 1,000 people that don't know each other to look at each other's work and know that they did something in relation to the amount of work that was required. Yeah. And that's all, that at its core is this idea of the difficulty target, and then the difficulty adjustment being how do we basically gate or synchronize as things speed up or slow down to ensure that we're kind of within a frequency.
That's right. Without the difficulty adjustment, if we'd stayed at the initial difficulty, we'd be finding a block like every second, right? And more realistically, what would have happened is that we would have speed run all of the subsidy blocks. And today, and
if you're finding a block every second, it's more likely that people are finding blocks concurrently, distributing them, and then the network can't reconcile which one of these actually did happen.
And you can't have a block size limit, because in order to say we're only going to have this many megabytes per day, you have to have two limits. One, you have to limit the number of blocks per day, and two, you have to limit the size of each block.
That's a very important point.
And so those two things go hand in hand as well.
Because it ensures that there's
scarcity of...
Yeah, after all of the Bitcoin is issued or entered circulation, that there's something to create prioritization or to require that people bid on the space.
Well, so you would still have that in the sense that you'd still have people using like child pays for parent to keep their order correct.
I know, but if it was like every second, it's like if time wasn't a limiting factor, then it's functionally infinite.
Right. And so to me, the bigger problem would be that only Google, Amazon, and Apple could run a Bitcoin node because of the resource usage.
Yeah. Because you would just be adding more data.
Right. Yeah.
With greater frequency at which you're changing the state of the network, the faster it is, the more you're compounding.
Yeah. And they'd be the only ones that'd be able to mine too. Like it would, and then they would decide on the monetary policy.
Okay. So now last question. And this is to bring it back up to a high level. A lot of people will describe the difficulty adjustment or the difficulty, because like oftentimes people say difficulty adjustment, but it's like, if you don't have a concept of what the difficulty target is, then how can you have a concept of adjusting it?
Yeah.
So those two things, difficulty target and difficulty adjustment, as being one of the most profound pieces of the puzzle that Satoshi put forward, and taking other puzzle pieces that had pre-existed over those 30 some odd years where cryptographers and cypherpunks were trying to figure out how to make a digital money system work. Drew Bonsall, friend, co-founder of Unchained, put forward an idea, and it's interesting coming from him because he was someone that I think has come around to the monetary side, but
from the technology side,
started from the technology side, has a physics background. When he did, his deep dive on the kind of the history of Bitcoin and like what he theorized Satoshi must have been thinking, that in Drew's mind, he thinks that Satoshi must have figured out that he needed a fixed monetary policy to make all of the incentives of the network work. And then once he would have figured that out, then he would have needed a way to meter the distribution, and that the difficulty adjustment and target would have logically followed that. What do you think? Do you think that?
Well, you could. I think the incentives would still work even if there was not a limited supply. In the sense that if there was no halvings, I think the incentives would still work.
If there were no halvings, you think the incentives would still work?
Yes. It's so.
Well, wait. Are you saying if there was no fixed supply that there would?
No, it's still there's no ceiling, but obviously they couldn't create more than 50 Bitcoin per 10 minutes.
No. What I'm saying is like, because even if there weren't halvings, but you still had the difficulty adjustment, you'd still need a way to meter it, to ensure that it all just didn't.
Yeah, you'd still have a difficulty adjustment. Yeah,
but do you think that the fixed supply came first in terms of in order to make this whole thing where I need a fixed supply, and now I'm just talking about how I distribute it, because you could still have the difficulty adjustment. You could say 50 every minute and adjust difficulty, or until we get to 21 million.
Yeah.
Or
I would argue that if we look at the white paper, that he started with, okay, we've got a centralized timestamping server. How do we make it decentralized? And
centralized in the sense of like, this is the way the central bank works.
Yeah, we've got a server.
Or a bank. How do we get this guy out of here?
He's got the proof of work part from Adam Back, right? And then he's adding in the difficulty adjustment. And that the issuance is, he's thinking, okay, well, how do I get the Bitcoin onto the ledger? He thinks of this clever hack of, I'll add it to the transaction fees. So that's the way I read the white paper. And that's where he says, the issuance, it can work like gold mining. And that's, he was the first person to call it mining. But in that context, in that paragraph, when he talks about it's like gold mining, he's specifically talking about the new issuance. He's not talking about the transaction ordering. But like the white paper doesn't say anything about 21 million. Doesn't say anything about, I don't think it even says anything about the halvings.
So it was only in the code?
It's in the code, yeah. And then the white paper, like his intent is to prove that he solved the double spending problem on the transaction side, not that solving the double spending problem was necessary in order to secure a fixed supply monetary policy.
One of life's great mysteries.
I don't think it's such a mystery. He wrote the white paper, right? I mean,
right, but he wrote the code first.
True, but
and he didn't.
When he's
he
communicating to the world of like what has he accomplished, to him the value of what he and look, I think we can debate whether it was the most important thing or not, right?
Right.
Because back to my point,
what I was putting forward was actually not what we think is the most important, but what
what he thought was
what
the most
he
important.
thought or the sequence with it which he put these things together, and that Dhruv, in his mind thought that he must have put the 21 million together. And an interesting point, I think Rob Warren put out a thread about this, so that both Wei Dai and I think Nick Szabo both initially when they saw the 21 million fixed supply, they thought that was what was going to cause it to never work. So there could be an idea that he realized that, but also realized that people would discount it. So maybe he just didn't emphasize that it was critical to the whole thing working in the white paper. But I think it's Bitcoin's working, and that's the most important thing. But I do think it's interesting to think about them in relation to each other. Of you have the monetary policy, and then you have the difficulty target and adjustment that helps distribute it.
I think that
to each other.
Satoshi's intent was to incentivize early adopters with this bait of the subsidy, and then he saw a necessity of phasing it out because at some point either it's taken off or it hasn't. And so that is really, I think, his thought process on what he writes in the white paper.
Yeah, and what I think Dhruv would say there is that the only way to value it, people needed to have some way to know how many there would be, and then if you come to that conclusion, then the most logical thing is that
people value dollars. We don't know how many there are.
Yeah, but if you started with the idea,
right?
If you started with the idea that these would always be infinite, then it would be that much harder.
Look, so I mean, as I mentioned, like on one hand, like we can say, the issuance schedule, it's all arbitrary. He could have done anything. I would argue that there's a tremendous amount of wisdom in what he ended up doing.
Right. Yeah.
And so, the 4 years between the halvings, the 21 million, like that number, I think that the mimetic value of it is tremendous.
Yeah. Well, people might need to listen to this one a few times. Like, understanding the difficulty adjustment is not easy, but it is critical to understanding really how the network works. And how the miners are able to work all in unison and reach a consensus. And so I appreciate you coming downtown.
Next time we'll talk about the doom spiral of
we can do an episode on that. Yeah, for sure. There's always going to be
once in a while
a death spiral.
Yeah,
every time the rate of issuance gets cut in half. So if you're willing to do that, we can. We'll look at the calendar, because we should definitely
that'd be fun.
Talk about how we know that there won't be death spirals every 4 years.
Every 4 years.
All right. Well, Pierre, thank you.
Thank you.
All right.